How's it going, everyone? We're going to be talking about the Electoral College and how that affects election strategy. And I'll give you the answer first, and then we'll run the numbers and show you exactly why election strategy is affected in that way. So here's what the Electoral College does. It forces political parties to favor positions that are liked in the suburbs, mostly. It forces political parties to have more moderate positions than they would otherwise. It makes it less likely that the cities can dictate policy to the rest of the country and only the cities feel represented and the rest of the country doesn't feel represented. That can happen. It's quite likely that that can happen if you just go by pure popular vote. But with an electoral college, it's less likely that that happens, more likely that there's representation of the entire country. It's also possible for the party that wins the majority vote to lose the election if you've got an electoral college. And it's also more difficult to cheat. Okay, with an electoral college, it's actually more difficult to rig an election. So let's get right into it. We're going to make up a hypothetical country here. So in our country here, we have 35% of the population living in the cities. We have 40% living in the suburbs, and we have 25% living in rural areas. Now, where do these numbers come from? These are approximately what the breakdown is in the United States. It's not exactly what the breakdown is in the United States, but it's nice round numbers that are easy to work with to make the point here. So we have this breakdown here. And we're going to make an assumption in this analysis. The assumption that we're making is that political divides tend to fall between city dwellers and rural dwellers. Okay, so for a large portion of political issues, that's where the political division is. You have city dwellers supporting one side of the issue, you have those who are in rural areas supporting the other side of the issue, and the suburbs are somewhere in the middle. Okay, I'm not going to get into why we're making that assumption too much, but there are certain economical and historical arguments that can be made that does tend to be the case. Okay, so in our hypothetical country here, there are two political parties. There is the C party, a party that's more on the pro-city side of policies, and there's the R party, the party that's more on the pro-rural side of policies. And when I say pro-city, pro-rural, I don't mean they support positions that are better for these regions. I mean they support positions that are more popular in these regions. Okay, so the city party is really liked by the city people, and the rural party is really liked by the rural people. So let's run some hypothetical numbers. Okay, so let's say there's an election, and out of the 35% of the population that lives in the cities, 30 of them support the city party, and only 5 support the rural party, as one would expect, right? And as for the 25% of the population that lives in rural areas, let's say only 5 of them support the C party, and 20 of them support the R party. Okay, so what do you have right away? Right, you have the C party has 35% of the vote, and the R party has 25% of the vote. And let's say the suburbs are split. Okay, so those 20%, those 40% vote 20-20 between the two parties. The C party wins with 55% of the vote if your election is just based on popular vote. Right? Now, what does that mean? It means it's a better strategy to just favor the cities. Okay, you overwhelmingly win the cities, you barely get any votes in the rural areas, assume suburbs are split about 50-50, you win the election, done. Now in fact, you don't even need the suburbs to be 50-50. Okay, let's say that only 15 out of the 40% that live in the suburbs, 15 out of 40 vote for the city party. Okay, now that is 37.5%, okay? And that makes the popular vote go 50-50, all right? So if the city party in this situation, they're overwhelmingly supported in the cities, they're overwhelmingly disliked in the rural areas, as long as they have more than 38% of the vote in the suburbs, they win, okay? Now if they have 38% of the suburb vote, that means 62% of the suburbs don't like them. Okay, so if your party is favoring the cities, it's overwhelmingly popular in the cities, it's very unpopular in the rural areas, and even if 62% of the suburbs don't like that party still wins the elections, right? And that's a solid strategy. What's going to happen with time is that our party decides, well, we can't win by favoring the rural areas, so we're going to have to start favoring the cities as well. And you end up with two political parties that are just competing with each other over who can please the city dwellers more. And all they have to do is overwhelmingly win the city dwellers. They only need 38% of the suburbs to support them. And they can even forget about pleasing the rural areas, and they win the election. So then the cities always feel represented. They decide all the policy. The suburbs and rural areas never feel represented, and they don't decide the policies. So you just have the cities dictating policy to the rural areas and the suburbs. That's the issue with a system that is based on popular vote. Now, there's two questions people often ask. One question is, well, why is it the cities dictating policy? Shouldn't it be the suburbs dictating policy? Because there's more people in the suburbs, so wouldn't the popular vote be more dependent on the suburbs? Okay, now this is again where our assumption comes in, that for most political issues, the divide is between the city people and the rural people. So it's very easy to think of a set of policies that city people will support. Just for every political issue, take the side that's liked by the cities. Similarly, it's easy to find a set of issues that the rural people will support. For any political issue, just take the side that's supported by the rural people. For suburbs, you got to find the right compromise, and that's much more difficult because for any issue that has two sides, there's an infinite number of compromises. Okay? Take, for example, gun control. It's very easy to think of two one-sided positions. No one's allowed to have guns, or everyone's allowed to have guns. Those are the two sides. Now, what kind of compromise can you think of? Infinitely many. Who is allowed to have which guns, under which conditions? You can argue about who and what conditions and what guns. So many different compromises. How are you going to find the compromise that most of the suburb people will like rather than the compromise that most of the suburb people will hate? Because that's how compromises work, right? You might find something that both sides love, or you might find something that both sides hate, right? If you're taking the political issues, and for some of them you're going to be more like what city people will like, for some of them you're going to be more like what the rural people will like, and you have to find that right combination of what to be more pro-city in, what to be more pro-rural in, so that most of the suburbs like you. That is a very, very difficult task, right? You might very easily accidentally find a compromise that the suburbs hate. So that is a very difficult strategy. A much more robust, solid strategy is just favor the cities all the time, and you only need 38% of the suburbs vote. And let's say you do pick the strategy of trying to overwhelmingly win the suburbs, and there's some political issue for which you don't know whether to take the city side or the rural side. Well, guess what? You should take the city side, because that's the safer bet, because there's more people in the cities, right? So even the pro-suburb strategy kind of turns into a pro-city strategy. Okay. Now the other question people might have is, well, why is this even an issue, right? It's democracy. Majority rules. Okay. If there's more people in the cities than the rural areas, then it makes sense that the cities have more influence than rural areas. And I mean, it's all one country anyways. People, regardless of where they live, they still know each other and care about each other and are dealing with the same issues. So why would that be a problem if the election is much more sensitive to how people vote in the cities? Well, so that argument makes sense for a small country. Okay, if you can drive across the country in a few hours, everyone in this country knows people in the suburbs and the rural areas and the cities, and they have family there, and they all regularly interact. They live in the same climate. They deal with the same economic markets. They all have the same issues. Then yeah, that makes sense. That's a reasonable argument. But in a large country, two different regions of the country might be on opposite ends of the continent. They might have different climates. They're dealing with different sectors of the economy that they're mostly influenced by. They could even have different cultures and be speaking different dialects, right? We say that, this one state has this accent and this one city has another accent. You could call that accents. You could also call that dialects. So when you have a much larger country, geographically, it could be much more difficult to keep the people united. And if in those conditions you just have cities dictating policy to the more suburban and rural areas, well, then the suburban and rural areas might think, well, the federal government isn't representing me, so why do we even need this federal government? And then the country might have a revolution on its hands. It might have a separatist movement on its hands, right? So that's a very uncomfortable place for a country to be in. So if you have a large country, it needs a system that will get the whole country feel represented by the federal government in a way better than what just an election based on popular vote would do. So what system is that? Enter the Electoral College. Okay, so we're going to change our thought experiment a little bit. Instead of cities and suburbs and rural areas, we're going to imagine a country that has 3 states. Okay, and one of these states has 35% of the population, and they have 35 electoral votes. Right? Because the number of points you have in the Electoral College should be proportional to what the population of the state is, right? Then we have, so we have one state with 35% of the population, and this state is more so defined by city life. Okay? It has cities and suburbs and rural areas, but the culture is more so defined by the cities. Okay? Then we have another state which has 40% of the population, 40 electoral votes, and the culture in this state is more defined by suburban life, even though they have cities and suburbs and rural areas. And then we have the third state, which has 25% of the population, 25 electoral points, and the culture in this state is more defined by rural life, again, even though they have cities and suburbs and rural areas. Okay, so in this situation, if you've got an electoral college, it doesn't matter what percent of the vote you win in a state, you get all of the electoral points of that state, okay, for most states, right? So let's say for the city state, right, do you win 20 out of those 35 that live there, or do you win 30, or do you win 18, right? As long as you win most of the votes in that state, you get all 35 of those electoral points, right? And say for the rural state, right, it doesn't matter. Are you winning 13 out of those 25 people, or, well, 13 out of that 25% of the population, or are you winning all 25 of them, or only 20 out of 25? It doesn't matter. If you're winning the majority of the population in that state, you get all 25 electoral points of that state. And to win the election, you need most of the electoral points. In this case, we've got 100 electoral points. So as long as you win more than 50, you win the election. The C party is going to win all 35 of those city-state points, and the R party is going to win all 25 of those rural state points. And it doesn't matter that 35 is bigger than 25 because neither of them is winning the election yet. Okay? The winner is going to be whoever wins the suburbs. If the C party wins the suburbs, they have 75 points. That's more than 50. They win. If the R party wins the suburbs, they have 65 points. That's more than 50. They win. It doesn't matter, are they winning the suburbs by a lot or a little? Whoever wins the suburbs wins the election. Okay, and now we're going to go back to our original predictions that we made at the start here. Okay, so the presence of an electoral college forces the political parties to have a strategy that favors the suburbs. Remember, the suburbs, based on our assumption here, are going to be in support of some sort of compromise on political issues, because political divides are mostly between city people and rural people, and the suburbs are in the middle, right? So if political parties are competing over who pleases the suburbs more, well, then they're also forced to think of some compromise on the political issues that the suburbs would prefer. Now, remember before when we were talking about a system with a popular vote, we were saying that The strategy of trying to win over the suburbs is a very difficult strategy because you have to find the right compromise that's loved rather than hated, and it's just a much more solid strategy to just cater towards the cities. Well, in an electoral college system, you're forced to take that difficult strategy of catering towards the suburbs. Okay? And because the suburbs are in between and they want some sort of compromise between the two sides of political issues, well, that forces parties to have more moderate positions as well. Because what is a moderate position? It means a compromise, right? It means you're not one-sided in everything, right? That's what moderation is. Some of this, but not all of it. Some of that, but not all of that, right? So parties are more pro-suburb, more moderate. And you can't have a situation where the cities just dictate policies to the rest of the country, right? Because sometimes the C party will win and the cities and the suburbs get their way, right? Other times the R party will win and the rural areas and the suburbs get their way, right? And both pro-city and pro-rural strategies are reasonable strategies, right? You just lock in either the cities or the rural areas and hope that, and try to, not just hope, try to win over the suburbs as well, right? So at any given time, at least two of these three states are feeling represented. And they're going to alternate, right? Different elections, different parties win. And so the cities and rural areas do kind of take turns feeling represented while the suburbs are represented all the time. Sure, that's kind of favoring the suburbs over the cities and rural areas, but at least the cities and rural areas do get represented. They just take turns feeling represented. Whereas when we were talking about the popular vote, we had the cities represented all the time and suburbs and rural areas being represented never. We also talked about how it is possible to lose the popular vote but still win the election. Okay, so imagine you have a situation like this. Okay, let's say the city party, those 35% of the population that live there, let's say 18 of them vote for the C party, okay, and only 17 vote for the R party. And in the suburbs, 21 out of those 40 vote for the C party and 19 vote for the R party. Well, so the C party won the majority of the vote in both the city state and the suburb state. So they win the election because they get all 75 of those electoral points, okay? So it doesn't really matter now what happens in the rural areas. And let's say in the rural areas, only 5 out of the 25 voted for the C party and 20 voted for the R party. Well, the R party won the popular vote. They won 56% of the vote, okay? But the C party won the Electoral College. They win the election. It could also happen the other way around, okay? So let's say we have the R party wins 13 out of the 25% of the population that lives in the rural areas and 12 vote for the C party. The R party wins 21 of the 40% that lives in the suburb state. 19 vote for the C party. And in the city state, we have 30 of the 35 vote for the city party, only 5 vote for the R party, okay? The rural party. Well, so the R party won 2 of the states, okay? With 65 points, they win the Electoral College, they win the election, even though they only have 39% of the vote. 61% of the people voted for the C party, right? So this could happen, right? Where the majority of the population votes for one party, but a different party actually wins the Electoral College. And it can happen either way, in favor of the C party or in favor of the R party, okay? So yeah, that's an awkward situation, right? But how does it affect strategy? Is it a solid strategy to try to barely win 2 of the 3 states and not care what happens in the 3rd state? Well, I mean, that's not really an ideal situation. The ideal situation is you try to really win 2 of the 3 states. And then what happens in the 3rd one doesn't matter so much, right? You would try to win by a lot, just in case, right? Because you don't want to slip. Aim to win by a little bit, slip, and end up losing. You don't want that, right? You would aim to win by a lot, but because of the conditions in the country, you might only end up winning by a little, right? So this kind of awkward situation could happen, but it's not some ideal case that parties would desire and base their entire strategy on, ideally, right? It's just something they might be inconveniently forced to do based on conditions in the country. Whereas when we had the popular vote situation, the awkward situation of cities just dictating policy to the rest of the country because both political parties are just aiming to please the cities and that's it, well, that awkward situation would actually be a solid strategy in a situation where you have a popular vote, right? So in both systems, you do have an awkward situation that could arise, right, where a large portion of the population isn't really feeling represented. That could happen in both systems. But when you have a popular vote, that awkward situation, it's actually the result of a solid winning strategy that parties would regularly go for. Whereas with an electoral college system, that awkward situation is an inconvenient outcome that neither party ideally would want, right? So they wouldn't be, going for that as their ideal case, right? And that's better when the awkward, undesirable situation is not something that parties are encouraged to do, right? That's more reasonable, right? So the other thing, now it is possible for a party, like hypothetically speaking, to say win the cities and the rural areas, and then they don't have to win the suburbs to win the election, right? But in that kind of situation, right, we're talking about electoral college here, right? But again, because most political divides are between city and rural areas, if you're winning both the cities and the rural areas, like probably the suburbs are going to be voting for you too, right? Because they're tending to be in the middle of the cities and the rural areas in terms of opinions. Okay. Now, the other one thing we talked about is rigging an election. Okay. It is more difficult to do in an electoral college system. Okay. So let's say someone wants to cheat. They want to create a bunch of fake votes for the party that they like. What would they do in a situation where it's the winner of the election is based on popular vote? Well, they'll just go to a place where it's easy for them to create these fake votes and submit those fake votes, and that's how they would do it. Okay. In a situation where you have an electoral college, that is much more difficult to do. And now we're going to make our example here a little bit more realistic. Okay. Instead of one state defined by city culture, one defined by suburbs, and one defined by rural culture, we're going to look at it a little more realistically. Let's say we have 4 states defined by city culture, and they have 5, 10, 15, and 5 electoral points each. We have 5 states defined by suburb culture. They have 5, 10, 15, 5, and 5 electoral points each. And we have 5 states defined by rural culture. They have 5, 10, 5, 3, and 2 electoral points each. Okay, and someone wants to rig an election by creating a bunch of fake votes. Okay, so first of all, if they try to do this in the city states or the rural states, either they're wasting their time or they're going to have a really, really difficult time. Okay, because the city states, chances are they are going to vote for the city party, right? So if you're creating a bunch of fake ballots that are pro-city party in the pro-city states, you're wasting your time. That party's going to win that state anyways, right? Whereas if you're trying to create a bunch of fake ballots for the rural party in the city states, you're going to need to create a whole lot of ballots and not get caught. And it's going to be really weird when that result comes in and shows a pro-city state won by the rural party, right? Similarly, if you're trying to create fake ballots in one of the more rural states, I mean, if you're creating these fake ballots for the rural party, you're wasting your time. The rural party is going to win there anyways. If you're creating these ballots or these votes for the city party, but in the rural states, again, you're going to have to create a whole lot of them to overpower the rural party, which has a lot of real votes there. And if you do succeed, again, that's going to look really suspicious, right? That one of these rural states is suddenly won by the city party, right? So right away, it limits where you can try and do this rigging, right? It forces you to do it in the more suburb states, okay? So the suburb states in our example here, right, or the one suburb state here, it's basically our swing state, okay? These are your swing states, okay? And it's interesting that when you look at the United States, who are the swing states? The swing states are not where the biggest city life is, but they're also not the most rural states, right? They are kind of more suburban. But anyways, so right away, it limits to where you can even try to cheat in an electoral college, right? You have to try to cheat in the suburb states. But now it gets more difficult. You can't just pick one suburb state and create a bunch of fake votes there, because it doesn't matter how many fake votes you create. The most you can ever win is still just the electoral points for that one state. You want to create a meaningful difference by cheating, you're going to have to cheat in a whole bunch, if not all, of those suburb states. So that's a much more difficult task, right? If you have an election just based on popular vote, you go wherever it's convenient for you, create as many votes as you can. But if you want to try and cheat and create a bunch of fake votes in an election where it's based on the Electoral College, well, there's only a specific subset of states where you could actually do this to have a meaningful result. And you can't just pick one state from that subset. No, you have to pick a bunch of locations from that particular subset and run the cheating game in all of those locations. That is much, much more difficult to do, right? So that's another effect of the Electoral College, is that it makes it more difficult to cheat. So that's how the Electoral College affects election strategy. I hope you enjoyed running these numbers as much as I did, and until next time, enjoy.